Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. As always, I'm Alex. We are almost a week after the first round of the draft. Now here on Wednesday, I submitted a form for you guys to post your questions about the draft, and I would get them on this episode of Bolt Breakdowns. I asked Twitter and YouTube for questions, so this will be a fun episode where we talk about the draft class. First of all, I want to thank everyone who watched the 3-day draft stream. Super fun to do that with Steven and Tyler and Arjun and Alex Katzen. You guys smashed viewership numbers, and we got some fun reactions in there to some picks. So it was really fun chatting it up with people and knowing that, I don't normally do that as much anymore. So thanks to everybody for coming out for that. Thanks to everybody who supported our content, through draft season. It was fun to, talk to Mina Kimes and, the other Pete Jordan Reed and all the people that I got to talk to, those kinds of interviews, or just even me bullshitting with, some other Chargers podcasters. That stuff doesn't happen unless you guys, keep watching and then really promoted the show. So it's, really fun time out there to be making Chargers content. Might take a slight break after this because I am tired, but I wanted to do this episode and get all my thoughts out on the draft. And I know a lot of you guys have some thoughts too. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. This comes from Twitter, put out the Q&A form. The first question is actually not from a Chargers fan. It's from Chiefs Out West, who is a Chiefs fan who interacts with me on Twitter. But he asked, and I've seen a lot of Chargers fans ask a similar question, as opposed to first-round offensive tackle and second-round wide receiver, were there any combinations of first-round wide receiver and second-round offensive tackle that you would have preferred? So this obviously kind of talking about the debate I've seen between some Chargers fans talking about like the value of Alton McConkey versus what the value of Neighbors and, Patrick Paul would have been, right? Or Neighbors and second-round tackle, meaning, of course, the run on offensive tackles happened in the first round with 7, 8 of them going. And then the Chargers, if they had taken Neighbors or if they had taken, Marv or some player basically that, wasn't a tackle, then they would have had trouble in round 2. And, I think if you're just boiling it down to wide receiver tackle or tackle wide receiver, yes, like I think Alton McConkey was the better combo. But I also think that I'm not sure that the Chargers would have gone tackle in round 2 had the run started, right? Because that assumes that, okay, well, they were just going to take wide receiver and tackle no matter what in whatever combination. I don't really think that's true, right? I think that Joe Ortiz and Harbaugh were prepared to do, build their draft around Joe Alt, right? And so when they took him at 5, knowing who the first 4 picks were realistically going to be, unless there was like a last second, offer for a quarterback, which never materialized for the Cardinals, then they knew they were going to build the rest of their draft around Alt, right? And so then they went with McConkey round 2, rest of the draft plays out from there. But like, I think that the way that Ortiz talked about it, right, is wanting to control the draft. And so I think assuming that he would have taken a less good player at a position of, need or perceived need doesn't really make sense to me, especially because the Chargers had a bunch of needs, right? Maybe they take Neighbors in round 1 and then they go corner in round 2, or maybe they take defensive tackle in round 2 when that run of defensive tackles started, right? So I think assuming that they would have done the same combination, but in reverse order, probably doesn't line up with what the Chargers' big board necessarily was or what their ideology was. And clearly, the Joe Alt pick, and Harbaugh and Ortiz have kind of said this a bunch of times, is not necessarily a statement of what they think of Pipkins as a player in negative context, right? They take Joe Alt because they think he's going to be a Pro Bowl, All-Pro tackle for the next 10, 15 years, right? Like that's what they believe of him. I don't think it's like, man, we think Trey Pipkins is unplayable, we got to replace him, right? And so that wasn't the attitude going into this draft. And so I think had they taken Neighbors, had they taken somebody else in round 1, I don't know. The draft would have obviously gone differently, I think, than it did. But I don't believe that they would have been locked into taking tackle in round 2. I don't believe that they would let the rest of the draft control them. And that's kind of implicated by their trade up for McConkey anyway, where they go, okay, these receivers are starting to come up the board. Let's get the best trade we can to move up to take, our preferred wide receiver prospect. So I don't think they would have just let the board fall to them and go, ooh, bunch of wide receivers going here, bunch of tackles going here. We got to take one at this pick, right? I think their attitude throughout the draft shows that they were willing to control as much as they could. So, long-winded way of answering that is I think the combo they went with was the right combo to an extent. If you're just talking about wide receiver and tackle, I'm also not sold that that would have been the combination had it been the other way around, because we don't know. Michael Morgan. Now that we all think we are winning the Super Bowl, what remaining free agents would you target to round out this roster? Didn't address safety. Could we be a fit for Justin Simmons? Is Boyd, MVS, Chark still in the cards? What about a guard? I don't think they sign a guard. I think they're pretty okay on the offensive line as of now. There were some people talking about obviously not drafting a center, but I think that's kind of why they got Bozeman in the first place, which gives you some insurance if a Norzad or somebody like didn't crack your way in the draft anyway. Plus, somebody like that probably wouldn't have started to begin with, right? I think the only center prospects who were like day one starters in this draft were JPJ and Zach Frazier, right? So I don't think that is kind of what the Chargers would have done. As far as other free agent targets, I think that you were looking at the wide receivers, to be honest. Now, I think a lot of people have like eliminated wide receiver in their minds because they went with Brenden Rice and they took Cornelius Johnson in the 7th round. But I don't know if they envision those players having large offensive roles this year, especially given how raw both of them kind of are as prospects, to the point where they're not necessarily bankable in terms of like volume production from day one in terms of their route running ability, right? I think what the best role is for both of them starting out is being a member of that Ryan Ficken special teams unit, blocking on offense, right? I think you're going to see the premium options on this offense ultimately to be McConkey, Palmer, Johnston, which, maybe a receiver, maybe Darius Davis getting a little bit involved as well. I don't think they're going to put a ton offensively on Brenden Rice or Cornelius Johnson's plate from day one. So I still think wide receiver could be in the cards. Obviously, they met with DJ Chark right before the draft. They showed interest in Boyd and MBS. Boyd, I think, is a little redundant at this point, just because I think you have Palmer and McConkey, who both can kind of play the slot. Brings in vet experience, but I tend to think the receiver type they drafted, that is kind of a little redundant to me. As far as Justin Simmons, I don't think Simmons is coming here, and I don't think they would really pay Simmons with what they paid Derwin and Alohi, or making a combined $24 million this year. And also, I don't think there's really, I don't think you pay Alohi $5 million to then have him essentially be safety 3 behind those two. I think they're kind of set at safety, but we'll find their rotation guy, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get to the UDFA questions and what the safety group kind of looks like. I don't really think they're a Simmons contender. In general, I've gotten a lot of free agent questions. I think the ones to monitor to me in terms of positions are probably wide receiver, edge, safety, and then maybe still like a look at corner, only because, I think you could look at defensive linemen and interior offensive line too, but those markets are looking a little bone dry right now compared to some of the other wide receiver, cornerback markets. So I think it also depends on kind of what's available too. Non-draft question, had a thought about the new kickoff return rules. This comes from Eric Jr. Feels like that's an area where Quinton would thrive as a returner, not fully just about speed anymore, but someone with high yak and vision. Seems like Quinton would be an awesome piece back there. So honestly, I find new kickoff rules entirely confusing. I'm probably not going to learn them until I have to learn them. I've watched videos where I'm still like, what? In terms of trying to like process it. I know it's essentially a version of the XFL kickoff from a couple of years ago. I think Ficken will play around with like guys that kind of work there. I think Darius Davis is still probably your punt returner, kick returner. Obviously, McConkey is kind of experienced in some sort of special teams way as well. And I don't know if they really throw QJ back there. I also think Quentin Johnston, his best athletic abilities kind of come when he gets the ball in motion, as opposed to like, okay, I'm just gonna like run by you, right? Or like kind of blazing speed on a kick return. I think his athletic ability is a little bit different than that. I think he's a guy that you kind of want to set up for like broken missed tackles and stuff like that via like a screen pass or something along those lines, more so than like, okay, he's gonna just like make a guy miss on a kickoff return. I don't know if that's his bag, in my opinion. You can try it, see what they like in the preseason. It also depends on how much they envision Johnston being a volume receiver too, because like you don't want to overextend him playing special teams if he still is going to be a priority wide receiver for them, which I ultimately believe he will be. So we'll see. I think Fickham will play around with it, but we'll see. At Chargers Truther, what can we expect from the 6th round running back? So obviously talking about Kamani Vidal here, and Kamani Vidal, as people saw with my reaction, was one of my favorite picks in the draft. I love the little 5'8", 5'9" running backs who are just bowling balls that are shot out of a cannon, play with a certain physicality. That's been my type, talking about Khalil Herbert, Pacheco, in previous years. I think Vidal is an interesting guy in terms of how he cracks this rotation, because obviously they have Gus, they have Dobbins, but unlike Spiller, unlike I think Josh Kelly in previous years, I think that you can kind of ask Vidal to be a special teams guy. I think you can ask Vidal to be a great pass blocking guy. Obviously, his size is a little bit of a limitation in that regard. But if you watch the Troy tape, and Ortiz brought this up in his press conference, he is a very willing pass blocker who is just willing to take the other team's opposing linebacker and like get right in his gut. I think that he is going to be someone that, sticks around in not just what he's doing from a rushing standpoint, but I think the other Chargers day 3 picks have lacked what they do when they don't necessarily have the impact on the football. And Ryan Ficken, Brandon Staley have indicated that kind of as why, Spiller has been a healthy scratch sometimes. So I think Vidal in that area is certainly an upgrade. And then I think Vidal just as a runner, 94 missed tackles last year. He is very hard to bring down, as annoying as Eckler was maybe early in his career in that regard. And I just think he'll get dinged because I think when he goes out wide, people will say he's not like quick, but this is like an athlete. This is a guy who tested the way he did at the combine for a reason, and it shows up kind of on tape, particularly when he's between the tackles. I sort of think he is a similar skill set to like a Blake Corum, but to me, whenever I watched Vidal versus Corum, and this is partially because of Corum's injuries, like I just thought Vidal had that kick of like athletic juice way more personally than like Corum did, which is why I didn't necessarily want Corum for a backfield where it's like, okay, you have Gus and you have Dobbins, and it's like, I just think you need someone who has sort of that short area quickness, a guy that can break a lot of tackles. And Vidal just throughout the whole process was that guy to me. Go watch his game against App State. Go watch, any one of his games this season. I just think he's a proven, tough commodity that if he's asked to play running back year 1 and maybe there's injuries in the running back room, he can do that. He can step in and play special teams. I think he's going to be a guy that a lot of Chargers fans end up liking to root for. Obviously, I don't think a lot of Chargers fans have watched him because he's not coming out of Alabama. He's not coming out of one of these national schools. But download that all 22, and I promise you it has some fun stuff. And I think, Herbert did like having Eckler as like that check down safety valve kind of option. And I think Vidal showed, particularly in all of his years at Troy, that like if he's given that responsibility to like stay close to the line and be a little bit more of a receiving after the catch threat, that's something that he kind of presents that I don't think that Dobbins and Edwards necessarily do in a receiving capacity. So I think that he can bring that as well. But I'm very excited about Kamani Vidal. I think he's going to be a lot of fun. This next question comes from Slow Cheetah, at Slow Rationale. We know that draft picks usually have a low probability of panning out. For this draft to be successful, who would have to be the starters, contributors, reliable backups? I think defining expectations compared to draft norms would be helpful going forward for fans. Yeah, so, we've always talked about, I think, in terms of Telesco, in terms of like the previous regime in general, like the Chargers just haven't gotten a lot of day one contributors out of the 3 days of the draft, right? They would get a guy in round one, they would get a guy in round two, reach in round three for a project, right? And then maybe one year they would have like a Sally or somebody who was able to immediately play a role, but like their day three picks are very hit or miss. Now, as Slojita points out in his comment, right? Like that happens for all teams, right? Like even the best of the best GMs that we associate with greatness, right, in reality are hitting between like 55-60% of their picks, right? So it's not like it is this thing where the bad GMs are always picking like bad players. The bad GMs get good players too, right? It's just on this range between like is it 40% of your picks hitting or 60% of your picks hitting? As Arjun has this graph, I know for PFF, that talked about kind of the GMs and the teams that get that higher EPA per play out of the draft, based on the number of picks. So I think that that's really what we're talking about, is winning within the margins. And I think you look at this Chargers draft, in terms of instant contributors, Joe Alt, going to be your right tackle. Ladd McConkey, potentially your wide receiver one. Junior Colson, to me, is your starting linebacker, and I think that will be the case with Jesse Minter as well. Boydby going to play a lot of snaps at defensive tackle. Don't have a ton of talent there right now, to be honest, especially after kind of reshaping the room post Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson leaving, so he's going to play a lot. You go to round 5. I don't know what Tarheeb Still's role is to start. We'll talk a little bit about him later. I think Cam Hart has a chance to start from day one, based on the fact that he just has this size, this length, this rangy kind of athleticism that no one else in the corner room really does. And like, if you need him to man up against a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., like he's shown in college that he's capable of doing that. So I think he's a guy that, especially as older as he is, as veteran tested as he was in college, he could be a guy that starts day one. I think that that's very possible too. Vidal going to have a huge role on special teams early. We'll see with the health of Dobbins and how that holds up. But he's a guy that could very well get some running back volume and rushing volume in year one. And then you go to the two receivers, right? I think how much they end up playing in a non-special teams role depends on what happens with the other receivers. Are they going to bring a guy in? But, you're looking at this draft between those 9 picks, and I think the Chargers came out with at least 6 instant starters, maybe 7, right? And so that's good for a clean up of this draft. Now, obviously, all those players have to end up executing on their end, but I think there have been days where we talk about Telesco drafts and we're like, that guy's a bit of a project, or maybe he drafted like 3 projects that were more long-term value down the road. If they eventually did blossom. And I really think the only player they did that with in this draft is Tarheeb Still, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, really just not that many reaches. And I think a lot of guys that can be instant contributors, like Slojita said. The next one comes from BRT 86 Chargers. Do you think that they'll add a wide receiver post-draft like MVS, in which round 7 receiver, if either is likely to make the 53 and have some sort of impact? So I don't know if I think they add a wide receiver. I think, to me, it makes sense to add a wide receiver just because I think they need a veteran presence in that room. They don't have, the most senior member of that core now is Josh Palmer. Like, I would like a bit more of a seasoned approach at wide receiver, regardless of who that ends up being. I think maybe that becomes kind of more of a training camp conundrum at this point than like they need to go sign a guy because of how the draft broke and they got 3 receivers. I don't know what exactly the role that they have planned for Brenden Rice and Cornelius is in year one, but if you ask me who's more likely to make the roster, I think I would go with Rice only because I think that he has a more prototypical kind of wide receiver like build. I think that he is a more efficient player as a wide receiver in terms of like being able to contribute right now in terms of his route running, fewer drops, just fewer mistakes that he kind of makes on the field compared to Cornelius, who I think is a little bit more raw on offense by comparison, especially if you look at kind of the advanced metrics. Both will have a chance to make the roster, but I think honestly, the one that makes the roster, honestly, is not going to maybe come down to offensive impact. If one of the two of them makes the roster, I think it will come down to what they're doing on special teams and what they're doing on blocking in the preseason, right? Like, I think it'll come down to the margins more so than, oh man, like Rice caught a crazy touchdown in this preseason game, or he's making catches in camp. I think they're going to look to directly who's going to have more of a role in the trenches and blocking more so than who's going to have the better offensive production, especially if neither of them is getting the volume in year one that a Palmer or a QJ or a McConkey is getting, right? So I think it'll come down more to that than their offensive production. But if you made me bet, I'll probably say Rice for now. With the addition of Big Joe Alt Delete, is there a future where Pipkins slides inside at guard, or he'll likely be strictly swing tackle? So this was something that got brought up because Harbaugh said in his post-draft press conference on day one, obviously, that they envision Trey Pipkins as one of the 5 best players, even with the addition of Joe Alt, which kind of insinuates that they could move him inside. And the coaches, I think it was Mike Devlin who was speaking at the podium yesterday, and they basically said they still like Pipkins. They still like his length. They still like his size and what he can provide. So I think that's something they'll experiment with in training camp, and they've kind of made that clear that, like, outside of Zion and like Bozeman, I think that maybe that Salyer spot could, in theory, be Pipkins. But again, you're talking about Pipkins, who has not played interior offensive line in the pros, right? Like, I do believe in this coaching staff if they believe he has the physical tools to try to put him there. But you need to see how he responds, right, in training camp in the preseason to that role before you go, oh man, okay, we're confident that he can, do this, stamp of approval, right? So I think that will take a little bit longer to decide than people think. I think they'll experiment with it. I think it's a possibility. But I also think, the one thing that I've seen maybe from Chargers fans is like, okay, well, we drafted Joe Alt and Pipkins is going to be a $10 million swing tackle. I'm like, is that the worst thing in the world, right? If Pipkins is swing tackle, right? He would be one of the better swing tackles in the league in terms of offensive line depth. And if Slater or Alt, God forbid, goes down, like, you have the ability to put someone who has some serious starting experience in the NFL. And someone who, despite a down year last year, didn't, had 3 games where he gave up 5 or more pressures, right? So this is a guy that I still think is respected around the league, clearly respected by the Chargers. I think they'll try to find a starting role for him on the offensive line, but if it doesn't pan out that way, I think there are worse problems than having an expensive swing tackle for a contract that this current regime didn't sign. I think they view Trey Pipkins as a player more than some financial roadblock against clearly drafting Joe Alt or, what their moves on the line are. I think they'll, like Harbaugh said, put the best 5 out there. If that's Pipkins at guard, okay. If that's Pipkins at swing tackle, okay. I think they're prepared to do whatever is kind of best for the line. But I'm curious to see how Pipkins would work out at guard, but I also don't think it's the worst thing if he's the swing tackle either, like some fans maybe have kind of made it out to be. What do you think the best 5 linemen are, and where does McFadden fit? I think he looked great in limited reps last year. Def more juice than Salyer. I don't know if I would say McFadden has more juice than Salyer. I think, more athletic potential maybe there than Salyer for sure. If you made me predict right now what the line is, like left to right, I would probably say Slater, Zion, Bozeman, Salyer, Alt. I think that could be the left to right line, kind of putting Zion back more in the position where he originally succeeded back in his rookie year. That would kind of be my idea of like what to do. But again, that depends on how much do they believe in this Trey Pipkins to guard thing, right? If they believe it and we see it in the preseason, then okay, right? Like then maybe Pipkins will slide into Sally's guard spot, right? It's possible. I want to see what it looks like in training camp. I want to see what it looks like in the preseason, though, before I really start buying that they could do it. Jose Martinez, Chargers not addressing center. Do you feel like the board just didn't fall right for them to grab one, or do they truly feel like they have the center of the future on the team right now? So obviously, like center of the future on this team would be a comment more so about what do they think about who did we just talk about? Sorry, I'm blanking on his name. McFadden, right? And Harbaugh had mentioned him as a potential center candidate with his, athleticism and his ability to potentially kick inside. A lot of range, a lot of versatility there. And in Harbaugh's view, as he said at the owners' meetings, I don't know if they view McFadden as a future interior offensive lineman fit. We'll see on that one. Again, that's kind of like Pipkins. Like you have to see how they respond to real reps. As far as like the, not addressing center in the draft, I think if a couple guys slid down their board, if Norzad didn't end up going where he went, if, they had a little bit better luck on day 2, then maybe they would have taken one. But again, I think this goes back to like Ortiz being like, okay, we don't feel like we have to take that position, right? We don't feel like we're going to be pigeonholed. And I think that was a huge part kind of of the Bozeman signing, which is like, all right, we have him starting, if Frazier or, JPJ or somebody that we really love ends up having this crazy fall, then maybe, but we're not going to feel pressured into doing something that we don't want to do, or we don't think the value is right for in terms of day 3 guys as well, like Norzad or Bo Limmer. So, I think the board just didn't fall their way, which is kind of unfortunate because I do think this was a really good interior offensive line draft, but I think they're kind of prepared to, do whatever it takes. I just feel like, I don't think it's a statement about what's on the roster, more so, like you said, kind of how the draft board fell to them. At ZXZLot, what's the status of Okoye and why didn't Akeem Dent get drafted? His highlights are great. What are your thoughts on him? Okoye is still in the international player program, so he'll be back for camp, and I don't think he'll count against the roster number this year as a member of the international player program. I'm not totally certain how that works. That's more of a Katzen question. I know I've asked him that in the past, and I still kind of don't remember the answer. As far as Akeem Dent, so that goes back to what Katzen was saying. I think the Chargers had thought about taking him as a guy in round 7 to make sure that he doesn't hit undrafted free agency, but they ended up opting to take Cornelius Johnson and Brenden Rice in round 7, just in terms of the value of their board. So as far as why he didn't get drafted, I don't know. I have watched a little bit of Akeem Dent out of that undrafted free agent class, and I do think he is one of the better potential fits to make the team in terms of him against AJ Finley, him against JT Woods, as I think Steven and Tyler maybe both mentioned on the show. But I think he's one of the ones that really has a chance, has a lot of athletic juice. I honestly like him a little bit more than I do Tarheeb still as like secondary players. But I do think that I'm not sure why he didn't get drafted. I think some teams just end up valuing ball production more than others. And that might have been why Dent ended up kind of slipping. But I don't think there was like an underlying, oh man, here's the injury concern or something like that pushed Dent down the boards. At S. Farouk, what is the most glaring need post-draft? I don't know if I would say there was a glaring need. I'd probably say like DT, interior offensive line. But I think if you're talking about that question in terms of like which free agents they should sign, I really think the DT and like interior offensive line markets are pretty barren right now. So like I don't suggest that they address those. Wide receiver and corner, they could still end up addressing too, even though they took multiple in this draft, just because I think those rooms are still not necessarily NFL up to snuff in terms of competing with some of the best teams in the AFC. So I still think you look for free agents in that way. But But I think if you're just asking what's the biggest need in terms of like kind of a almost 2025 draft context too, you're probably looking at DT, corner, interior offensive line as some of the positions still kind of left to address. This comes, Jacob F. If there was one spot in draft rounds 4 through 7, you could swap for a different player, who would it be? And this is kind of linked with the next question. Tom Banaluk, early thoughts of Still. Have you watched him? Still is the one player that I would swap out for another one. It was the Chargers' biggest reach on the consensus board. They ended up, it was a difference of like 116 spots from where they took him to where he was ranked. And I asked Alex Katzen, who tracks about 400, 500 of these players, like, hey, where do you have Still on your board? And he was like, I didn't have him. And so that's not necessarily a great sign now. In terms of day 3 reaching relative to like day 2, day 1 reaching, I certainly think is less bad than, reaching on day 3 for a guy that you think is a fit. And day 3 value is a little bit more subjective than like objectively tracked by the boards anyway, with as many guys as these teams study. And clearly they still find players that maybe by round 6 or round 7, we have no idea who they are. That was a little different this year with the guys that they took, but that kind of pick ended up happening in round 5. I think that they view Still as a very good run defender, good tackler who can kind of like quick trigger downhill in that way. But man, Still is still raw as a coverage player. He ended up allowing 1,600 yards in college, 20 penalties, and 65.9 completion percentage against him last year. And it kind of shows on tape too. I just think instinctually he's a lot better in the run game than the pass game. And I think the motive for drafting him is, okay, we have Minter, we have Clinkscale, we have O'Leary. Like, we have these guys in the secondaries that we think can coach some of these college players up traits wise to be what, kind of we expect them to be. Right. And so that is sort of what I think went into drafting Still, but I still think the value on the board, like, man, if you took Norzad in that slot, we're talking about maybe, a different tier of great draft. Right. Or if they just kind of, took a tight end there, if they had taken, any number of positions or players, I think it could have been a better pick. But that was really the only Chargers reach of the draft that stood out to me. And then I kind of watched the film after and I was like, I don't know about that one. And I kind of watched the film of like Thomas Harper or Akeem Dent or like some of these guys. And I'm like, kind of wish they went there instead of Still. So I don't want to come off as a Still hater. Obviously, we are rooting for all of these guys' success, but that was the one pick that stuck out to me, in day 3. That was like, I don't know about that one. Herbo season, do you think they still need some help on the interior defensive line? Yeah, I think they do, but I think they're kind of comfortable to roll out with the current group. I don't think there's a whole lot left on the free agency market. They already brought in like Poona Ford and some of these guys that they think can like have bounce back years. I just think it's going to kind of be one of those lines where they don't necessarily have, or one of those years where they don't necessarily have the ideal personnel that they envision in year 1. And there's going to be a couple of those positions, some of which we've already talked about. But Boyd B is like kind of their Chris Jenkins, but what if he was in round 4, right? Not that he's as good of a prospect as Jenkins, but a guy that they can envision sort of playing that relentless motor, same, defensive tackle role, who actually developed a nice array of pass rush moves last year. So I think they feel good about where the DT room is at. Obviously not what it will look like in 1-2 years from now. But I think it's a start. Do you really think a B+ is what Joe Alt deserves? Well, just following the trend. So it's funny, Chargers Twitter is but a fickle bitch, because I ended up giving Joe Alt a B+. Meanwhile, some of these people were crying and screaming that Joe Alt was the pick on day 1. I was not one of them, because we had told you the entire time, even though I like Malik Neighbors, that offensive line was going to be the pick. So I had time to contort myself. But we had people being like, oh, fire Harbaugh, burn all the bridges. And then, day 3 rolls around and I give the Alt pick a B+, and people were like, that grade sucks. That's not high enough. I'm like, Who do you people think you are? I just saw what you posted 2 days ago, and you're out here with your ass. So you know, it's all fun and games. I think it's fun, but I just think it's funny how over the course of 72 hours, people can go from this sucks to, oh, actually, I think Alton's always the right pick all along. It's like, okay, buddy, knock it off. Um, but yeah, I stand by my B plus grade. I think there was a better player to be picked there. It's not a big deal at this point. Like they did what they did with Joe Alt. I totally understand why they did it. I didn't have neighbors graded that much higher than Alt, and they ended up nailing a lot of the picks of the rest of the draft. A B plus is still a good grade. Like I'm not grading this on a Tyler Asian scale or what my parents expect of me. I'm grading this in a world where B plus is a good grade. So take it and shove it up your ass. Some of you on Twitter. Not this guy. Lord Ram Harbaugh has been cool. He's just joking. But some of y'all, some of y'all are a little much. Okay, anyway, we've been rambling for 35 minutes. Let's get to some of your questions from YouTube. In the sake of time, if you asked a question, if we have one question that we've already answered, then I'm kind of going to skip it, but let's get into some of these questions. There's like 71 comments. So let's see what we can do. At K's Finest, I've been a fan for over 30 years. I must admit on paper, this was our best draft ever. I'm ready for the season. People know who I am. I'm going to hesitate on calling it the best draft ever till we see the results. But I do think, and me, Steven, and Tyler all kind of walked away with the opinion that this was the most structured draft process that they had in a while, and certainly the best value from rounds 1 to 7 that I think they got on the board. A lot of players that we liked, a lot of players we were pretty positive on. Not many players I think any of us were pretty negative on throughout the process. So definitely one of the better value drafts, I think. And that kind of shows that Ravens Ortiz philosophy of, it doesn't matter what need you have on the roster, more so, again, getting who you think are the best players and, kind of building your draft more so around that than having to draft certain positions. And I think this was the first draft in a while where the Chargers, again, like I said, kind of had control of their draft and really capitalized on their philosophy more so than letting other teams decide their fate. This one comes from Andrew McFall. Why did Rice fall so much? Brenden Rice, he feels like he could end up being the biggest steal in the draft. So I think with Brenden Rice, it's a little simple. I think that the way that it kind of works in the NFL is teams really identify with traits with wide receivers. Obviously you kind of have your speed, you have your 4-2 guys, you have your contested catch, big body guys, you have your, crystal clean route runners, aka like a Marvin Harrison, right, type, and those guys that go towards the top of the draft. I think with Brenden Rice, it's just hard to kind of like peg him as like a player. He is a good physical body, certainly helps in your run blocking. I think what teams worry about with him to some degree, if you're like making me play devil's advocate about the pick, is his route running isn't necessarily the cleanest. And I think if you're talking about the amount of times he can, beat man coverage in particular, that was kind of one of his weaker spots in college compared to what he was able to do against zone. And sort of, it's also hard to analyze USC players sometimes because USC's offense is so non-fundamental and weird that I think that also kind of contributed to Taj Washington falling to the Dolphins, Brenden Rice falling to the Chargers a little bit. But I think Brenden Rice has a lot of the physical tools that you like. I just think he's good at a bunch of things and not necessarily elite at one trait, which means that to earn that offensive production in the league, I think he's going to kind of have to develop a few skill sets. I think he has the work ethic to do it. I think he'll start a lot on special teams this year. Like I said, good physical blocker. And I think he has the potential to eventually do more once we get down the road. But I think really, the day 3 receivers, I should say, are much more of a mishmash of like, what does each team like philosophically than like this strict board that people stick to. And so I think that's kind of one of the reasons Brenden Rice ended up falling. But I think he's a good pick for that value. I probably would have had a 5th round grade on him. He goes in the 7th round. Some people had him high as 3rd or 4th. to get him in that range, I think is pretty killer. And I think he's not necessarily going to make the biggest offensive impact early on, but I think you will feel his impact, assuming he makes the roster, in some significant physical ways compared to maybe some of the Chargers receivers of the past. So look, there's an open vacuum of a guy who could like potentially earn reps, right? There's no Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, like designated targets anymore, right? It's whoever feasts. And I think that will give Brenden Rice the opportunity to earn reps as well. So I know me, Steven, and Tyler were not like the biggest fans of like the Rice pick compared to some people on Twitter. I do think that there is an aspect of this where a lot of people are going to put a lot of expectations on him. And that's what I worry about in regards to like people like, oh, he's already Puka Nacua. No. So like let's cool it a little bit on that. Obviously, you can't ignore who his father is in this discussion. I've heard more about Brenden Rice's dad than I heard about Joe Alt's dad. I'll say that for sure. But, you know, I think in all reality, it is about, you know, him just kind of getting the opportunity to get his feet wet in an NFL training room, NFL offense, wide receiver coaching, right? And then his skill sets kind of develop from there. So, you know, we'll see. I think it is a steal for the value they got for it. I'm not convinced he's necessarily going to be like wide receiver 2 in like a year, like some people are. So we'll see. Joe Alexander, can y'all talk about the corners? Are they similar, or what are their strengths and play styles? So I think he's just talking about Tarheeb still and Cam Hart here. Tarheeb is kind of a guy who can rotate, I think, between the slot and the slot and the outside a little bit. He is almost kind of like a Max Melton you find on wish.com is how I describe him. But we're talking, you know, very much raw and less impressive athletically, maybe. I think that he's a guy that could compete with like Jaw Taylor and players like that to get that starting spot. But he has a long ways to go in coverage, in my opinion, before we really have like a designated role for him. But I think that that's kind of the role that you're potentially looking at him defensively. Obviously, we'll get some special teams reps like a lot of the day 3 guys. Cam Hart is kind of your big boundary, outside, lengthy, rangy corner, almost kind of like a Michael Davis was for this team for a while. Hart, a bigger body athletically, not necessarily as like quick as Michael Davis was, but I think he does have a lot of athleticism, graded as one of the higher corners in RAS in this class, and has had some big moments against Marvin Harrison Jr. and, you know, balled out this year in college. A lot of people asked me, like, why did he go so low? And I was actually talking about this with Alex Katzen live in our group chat when the draft was going on. And we talked about the fact that he actually has 2 surgically repaired shoulders. He's a little older, which, you know, teams are obviously wary of. But I think for the value that the Chargers got him in, you know, the potential to have a guy that can be a day 1 corner or starter at corner in round 5, that's some serious value. And I do value Hart's skill set a lot. And I think Minter even had a quote where he was talking about, you know, the NFL trending towards those, you know, bigger corners, and teams really want those guys that they think can, you know, really support their defense there at corner. And I think that's kind of where Minter really saw the value in Cam Hart. With the addition of Joe Alt at right tackle and Rashawn Slater at left, do you think the Chargers can have a top 5 rushing offense? I don't think that Alt and Slater are really what will determine the top 5 rushing offense. I think it's that interior and how they structure it, because that's kind of where a lot of the Chargers offense really struggled. Honestly, when they ran out towards the outside, that's where they had a little bit more success over the last 2 years. But it's been, I think, the inside of that offensive line that has created some problems for them, especially after Corey getting injured, in terms of generating a lot of those runs from the inside. So I think that will determine whether the Chargers are like a top 5, top 10 rushing offense. I think if you're talking about by volume, they might end up just being a top 10 rushing offense by how much they run the ball. By efficiency, you know, I'll wait and see as to whether they kind of end up being that type of a rushing offense or not. John Webb, what do you think of the plans for Pipkins? We already kind of talked about it, but I think Pipkins will remain the swing tackle until we see kind of what he looks like in training camp. Cut, trade, move a guard. I don't think they cut or trade him, which is what I'll say in response to this question. There's more value for Pipkins on this roster than off of it, and shipping him off for like a 6th or 7th round pick next year. I still think it's a luxury to have Pipkins on your roster, even if he is a swing tackle. At Bruins 31, how do you see the CB room playing out with the competition in the slot and the outside opposite Asante? If you're asking me like kind of what I would do, I think you start Asante day one outside. The other outside corner is probably one of Fulton or Hart. I would lean towards Hart until we kind of see more of Fulton potentially in training camp, but they have plans to kind of revive his career, so we'll see. And then the slot, I would still peg Ja Taylor or Mark Ja Taylor as the starter there until we see more from Tarheeb. I don't think it's an automatic that he's going to end up starting there, only because, in terms of what they have at corner, I think that his coverage liabilities relative to Ja, could be a big problem in terms of starting from the jump. You have Dean Leonard in that conversation too, who I actually think had some really solid games last year. So maybe an outside guy, certainly has the length to play the outside. But I'd probably say Asante, Hart, Ja Taylor as like your 3 corners. At Kai Jones, who plays the X receiver on this team? Also, who are the best blocking wide receivers? Can you please rank? I think you're looking at probably Palmer and Johnston being your boundary guys, and then McConkey kind of in the slot, but McConkey can also rotate between the slot and the X and the Z. So I think that's kind of like what you would be looking at in terms of like who plays the X receiver. I would guess it's Palmer this year, but obviously I think sometimes you'll have McConkey in that role. And then Johnston will be your other boundary wide receiver guy. Who are the best blocking wide receivers? I think Palmer's pretty underrated as a blocker. And then I would say Rice. The one thing I can say about Rice and Cornelius Johnson is they are both very high effort blockers, and I think that can generate some play time for them early. What was Zion's grade? Because I've seen him get beat a lot last year. So I don't have Zion's PFF numbers right in front of me or anything, but I mean, generally it was a worse year than his 2022 campaign. But I think there are, again, reasons that you should expect that with under a new coaching staff and playing next to a new center and this new reinvigorated approach. I do think there is the possibility for a Zion bounce back season. Right guard, we sort of talked about Pipkins. I think that I would peg Salyer as the starter for now, and then we'll see if Pipkins really can make a run at that spot. Casey Boyette, how many wide receivers do you think we keep on the active roster? Who do you think we keep, and what's the chances we sign a veteran like Boyd or Chark, because we have a ridiculously inexperienced wide receiver room at the moment? I think they keep 6. I think if I'm doing the math here, I think you're realistically keeping as locks Palmer, Johnston, McConkey, Darius Davis as your special teams role for sure. And then I think you have 2 more receivers outside of that. So I think that can be Brenden Rice. I think that'd be Cornelius Johnson. I mean, that's how it would slot right now in terms of if they sign a guy, then it's almost like you have that wide receiver, whoever they sign. Let's say it's Boyd. Let's say it's Chark. Let's say it's MVS, whoever. That wide receiver, Cornelius, Brenden Rice, and then your 3 undrafted free agents who would basically be plus Simi Fehoko. And you would have like 7 guys competing for those last 2 wide receiver spots. So I actually think it's going to be a pretty interesting training camp, depending on if they do sign a guy. I would say 6 chances they sign a veteran wide receiver. I think it depends on what they end up seeing from these guys kind of early on in training camp. And early on in this process at like OTAs and stuff like that. I don't think they're going to run to go sign a wide receiver. Zay Jones is obviously kind of in this conversation now too. He just got cut from Jacksonville. But I think it depends on what this room kind of ends up looking like, or how they see these guys progressing. Christian Farmer, what holes are left on the roster? For me, what do you see as the draft needs next year? For me, I think it's going to be defensive heavy, edge, CBDT. I agree with that list, and next year is actually a pretty good edge draft in the first round. good corner draft too. Defensive tackle, I don't know so much about in next year's first round class, but I think that's a pretty fair list. Edge definitely is something that I think is probably going to be more talked about as we get closer to next year's draft and next year's free agency, because you obviously have to deal with Bosa and Mack, right? We're back on these kind of 1 year cost cut controlled deals. So do they envision them as long-term pieces beyond 2024? For sure. Wide receiver is also always that kind of position potentially in the first round. But I think it depends on how they kind of end up reshaping the roster and in free agency next year, and what position they end up having. Because like if you're in that like top 10, top 15 range, you're in like some Will Johnson corner conversations. If you're a little bit lower, then maybe not, right? Loveland, tight end, who is expected to be in the first round. But again, very early for this stuff. As Arjun kept saying on our stream, we talked about Kalen King, who was a projected first rounder last year in what a PFF's mock drafts to the Chargers. And then he ended up going in the 7th this year, right? So it's like, who knows what that college class ends up being. At Ryan Carrillo, we sort of talked about this, but do you think we should have picked up a center in the draft or better than what we have right now? I think it's how the board fell to them. I don't think it was anything necessarily like intentional to not take a center. I think they would have taken one if the value was there, but they decided they wanted to fill other needs and positions first based on who was on the board. So I think they're fine with what they have on the roster right now between Bozeman, Jordan McFadden, who obviously we talked about, and some of the other guys who can end up kicking inside too. So I don't think that was that much of a concern for them. Given the lack of designated centers, center question, chosen in the draft and signed after, do you think they intend to move forward with Bozeman, or do they have plans to trade for someone? No trades. Bozeman is the starter, and I think that's just that. I don't think they have any plans to trade for anyone at this current point. If there's some kind of injury or something happens, maybe that can change. But I think the center room is what it is right now. What is Brenden Rice or Cornelius Johnson fit in this offense, and will either of them get significant playing time over a guy like Johnston? In terms of Johnston, no. I don't think either of them gets significant playing time over him. Harbaugh has talked about Johnston a lot. I think Ortiz has talked about Johnston a little bit too. They still have value in terms of him turning around. And look, it was a rough year last year in terms of the big drops that he had. He didn't have that many drops. It was when he dropped the ball. But obviously, the thing about Johnston is just more like he was a little bit rawer in terms of his release packages, got out physical at the line a lot, which was, kind of significant in terms of being able to, move properly off of the line of scrimmage. Happened to him in the Jets game, the Baltimore game, sometimes in the New England game in some man coverages, as opposed to when they were playing zone. But that's kind of the concern, I think, for Johnston going forward. But look, first round picks are first round picks, right? And I think, as we saw with the Kenneth Murray contract, right, despite what he's done at corner, despite what he's done at linebacker, that first round pick value and where teams can see you going in the league and still see the potential in you, that still has the potential to yield more opportunities, more money, right, in some of these negotiations at free agency. So I think Johnston will be afforded more opportunities after, what was kind of just one bad year. As far as Brenden Rice's and Cornelius Johnson's roles, I think that they both start kind of in more of a special teams capacity, and maybe one of them can be like a wide receiver 4 or 5 type early, depending on if they sign a guy in free agency or not. But I think you're not looking at either of them cracking like the top 3 spots, certainly on the roster. Talked about free agents. We talked about Pipkins. Tony Nguyen, can you explain the UDFA process? It is just first call, first get. So this is actually a little interesting in terms of the 21 drafted free agency signed, because we see that it's like, okay, they just like sign all these guys immediately. But like it's talked about during the draft, right? Like I know there was an article on like Xander Horvath a couple of years ago and what his agent was doing and like talking to teams and trying to get teams to like draft him. So there's like definitely a marketing pitch aspect to this, right? Where it's like, okay, well, take my player, or otherwise we might sign somewhere else in free agency. This was even true when the Chargers signed Duggan, and you had teams like the Cowboys and the Jets interested in undrafted free agency. They ended up taking Duggan in the 7th round, I think, because of a lot of those factors. So I think that's when you especially when you're talking about these like 6th, 7th round selections too, it's like, okay, not just what positions, what players are the best here, but who do we not want to hit undrafted free agency? And I think that also fueled the Cornelius Johnson and Brenden Rice picks to some extent as well. So players can basically choose to go wherever they want to go. I'm sure they get a lot of calls, a lot of backdoor negotiating, a lot of meetings with teams prior to the draft in terms of like thinking about who will be the interested suitors. But they get to choose where they want to go. OG Milkman, any disappointment for not taking a tight end at any point? In my opinion, no. I think it would have been cool to take like a Cade Stover or something, and I would have been behind that if they did that in round 4, or if they took a tight end at some point in day 2. I don't think it would have been a crazy reach given the value, but I think really once you got past the early day 3 tight ends, I just didn't think there was much value and as many guys that fit the Chargers' philosophy at tight end after that point. You have guys like Holker, who I personally liked, but I didn't necessarily think was a Chargers fit. And so, yeah, I just think the value didn't fall to them. They feel confident with Hurst and obviously Will Dissly, who they signed, and they still have Parham. They still have Stone Smart, Ben Mason, a bunch of guys kind of in that room who I think will end up being able to kind of like contribute in tight end / tight end fullback roles in Ben Mason's case. So I wasn't disappointed. I think it's kind of a catch-22 because I'm disappointed they didn't take a tight end last year in what was a really great tight end draft. And then this year it just never materialized because I didn't think it was that good of a tight end draft. So, kind of would have done something different last year, but didn't happen. At Brixton, which one of the UDFA guys do you think has the best chance of making the roster? As I said, I think that's Akeem Dent. Akeem Dent is a really athletic safety. He has really great instincts, can play the ball really well, does really well in coverage compared to some of the guys that were drafted or taken in like an undrafted free agent range. And so I think the Chargers made a pitch to him as to essentially kind of be that third rotational guy. Depends on if he can beat out AJ Finley, who I don't think is unbeatoutable, certainly, and then JT Woods. Right? JT Woods obviously had an illness / injury for large portions of last year that we still don't know exactly what happened. Brandon Staley and the franchise were very hush-hush about it. But it's just being able to beat out those guys. So I think Dent, really secondary guys in general, I think have the greatest inside track, but it wouldn't shock me in general. I mean, they signed 21 undrafted free agents. If you could have like 1 to 3 of them making the roster, but that's also something because I want to watch tape of some more guys. I've watched probably like 4 or 5 of the undrafted guys. I've not watched all 21 of them for sure. I don't know if I'm going to this year because I'm a little busy, but I think that's kind of the idea for the Chargers is probably more so one of those like secondary guys making the roster, in my opinion. At Brian Altman with the draft complete, what do you think the Chargers' next moves in free agency are? We talked about free agency already. Also, when do we expect Slater to get an extension? So Slater is interesting. Obviously, they picked up his fifth round option on Monday. And so I think that really any time between now and 2024 is when he could theoretically get that, or 2025, I should say, is when he could get that extension now that he's locked in. I think they kind of want to move decently fast on it, especially because, we've seen them do some of these market-setting extensions in the summer before, like Bosa, Keenan Allen also in that like summer 2020, Derwin James, right? That came after the draft too. I think they'll want to move on it just because, Penei Sewell just got the bag. I don't think that Rashawn Slater is going to be Penei Sewell's numbers, but he's going to comfortably get 24 to 27 million average annual value. That is a lock to happen. So I think they'll want to kind of maybe beat the market to that one. At Giovanna Sandoval, why do we think Brenden Rice fell to the 7th? Is there anything to be worried about? Is there a chance he doesn't make the roster, or will he be all right as the son of the GOAT? Overall feeling really good about this draft class. Bolt up. I don't think there was anything wrong with Brenden Rice. I just think he's a guy that is a sort of average athlete that I think can make some really impressive plays, big physical guy. But I think he needs to, refine some of his skill sets and some of his tools for the NFL level because he doesn't necessarily have that one killer attribute as a receiver. I think he can do that. I think this coaching staff is competent enough to use him in a role like that. but I think that's kind of what pushed him into day 3 range as opposed to going late on day 2 or something like that. And that USC offense, like I said earlier, is a little hard to evaluate. How do you see this wide receiver room along with protection for Herbie affecting QJ's numbers? He really didn't have as many drops on catchable balls as people make it seem, and Herbie getting that protection could be the thing that makes QJ take off. I don't really think QJ's drops were as big on like the lack of offensive line help. Quentin Johnston's focus drops were like a thing going back to college, honestly. So I think it's more just addressing that issue. And honestly, I've said this about Quentin Johnston going back to last year, but I don't think Quentin Johnston's biggest issue is the drops as much as they are publicized when they happen in the Packers or the Ravens or the Jets games, right? Some of those like big plays that kind of happened during the season. But like, I think that really what Quentin Johnston's biggest issue is he got out physical to the line in several games last year, like the Jets, like the Ravens, and just didn't have the tools when he was facing press man coverage. That's the thing that Quentin Johnston needs to develop in order to get better and in order to make an impact on this team. I don't think it has anything about the offensive line or Herbert catching Herbert rockets that result in drops. Like it's just about him needing to be more proactive in his release packages. It's about him needing to be more efficient as a route runner than certainly against Big 12 defenses, which had like a lot of defensive lapses and defensive breakdowns. That's really the thing with QJ. We talked about center. Bozeman's the starter. McFadden is an interesting depth piece. NSN. My biggest concern in Greg Roman's offense being a dink and dunk offense, a lot of rushing, screens, play action. Lombardi was trying to do the same thing, have a strong rushing game and a short passing attack. We and the rest of the NFL were frustrated with his offense and how Justin Herbert's average depth of throw was, low. Is that really going to change? Is McConkey a deep threat or more of a slack guy? I think, what this offense really wants to do is kind of what Staley sort of insinuated last year, right? When they talked about wanting to marry the pass and the run. Obviously didn't do that for a number of reasons, but I think this is going to be kind of less like a Lombardi offense and kind of more in vein of like what Kellen Moore tried to do, or a version of what Kellen Moore tried to do. Obviously more inspired by a lot of, Roman concepts and stuff he ran in Baltimore. But I think it'll be closer to what that optimally would have been with Kellen Moore than it would be closer to like Joe Lombardi, to be honest. I still think those deep shots will be taken if they have the ability to take the deep shots. The problem is last year and the last number of years, they either A, haven't had the protection to do it, or B, didn't necessarily, weren't at an optimal point health-wise to do it. So I'm concerned about Greg Roman from like a play calling standpoint, and I mentioned that before, but I don't think it's a situation where this offense will be dink and dunk. It's more just, do I trust Roman in situational instances, in third downs, and really going into the playbook. That's something that we'll find out, but I'm not necessarily concerned about the production of the offense, more so just what are they doing in those situational moments. I don't know if I would categorize McConkey as a deep threat. I think McConkey is certainly somebody who can like beat the defense over the top, but I think he's more of an intermediate. Like I think he'll be involved with Herbert in like check down plays closer to the line of scrimmage as well, and then use his yak like after. I think he's definitely more of a slot guy, but he's a guy that at Georgia was able to rotate to the Z and the X as well. At Lightfoot Bear Claw, looking at the wide receiver room, do you really think it was smart passing on Malik Neighbors? I have the same opinion that I just said when it came to the wide receiver or offensive tackle question. Like, I don't think, I guess, what they do in the rest of the draft either like justifies or doesn't justify the Joe Alt pick. I think they took Joe Alt because they believed he was the best player available, which is fine. Like I didn't have that much of a discrepancy in my grade for like him compared to Neighbors. He was my offensive tackle 1, so that's fine. It's just what my personal preference was in taking Malik Neighbors as one of the top 3 wide receivers that I've graded in like this draft process over the years, behind Marv and Jamar Chase. So that's just more personally what I would have done. I don't think it's like the worst thing in the world, certainly what they did in terms of passing on him. And I don't think it's as simplistic an argument of like, oh, it was Neighbors or Patrick Paul or, Alt or McConkey, right? Like those weren't the two binary options. So the draft would have played out in a very different way had they taken Neighbors. And I don't think that's inherently better or inherently worse. It just would have been different, right? Personally, I'm, as I said, of the mindset that like Neighbors was my favorite player at that position, but or where they were in the draft. So I'm not going to like change my mind about that they took Alt. I think they did well enough at the draft to complement the Alt pick, like I said. Do I think it was wise to pass on Neighbors? I'm not going to lean towards anything that gets people to hit the dislike button. What is the chance ASJ doesn't start next year? Very low. ASJ starts next year. You could, in theory, move him to like the inside if you didn't want to start him outside corner, but I also think that's a risky thing with this defense in particular with ASJ and run support to move him to the inside. But I think he definitely starts next year. Oh, I didn't specify. Yeah, which Alex? Because now we have Alex Katzen on the channel. It's Alex I, if you couldn't tell by the 1 hour and 6 minutes that I've been rambling. Talked about center and tight end. Why is no one talking about Palmer? Crazy. Y'all just forget about him when he's actually played in the NFL. I think we've all known how talented Palmer is. And he's certainly a wide receiver that can, in theory, put up that 800 to 1,000 yards of production. And we've seen him have that relationship with Herbert. It's just been, he's had the knee injuries, he's had the concussions, hasn't been able to stay on the field. And I don't think he's necessarily like the most dynamic athlete as a receiver, right? He is one of those more finesse route runner guys that I think has gotten better every year. It's just, needing to see that take another step, which we did last year. Unfortunately, the injuries also just kind of got in the way of him staying on the field. At Lightning Hobo, how do you grade this draft in relation to other teams? Who's got it better than us? How did TT and the Raiders do? I think the Raiders did pretty okay outside of the Delmar Glaze reach, which was, interesting. Yeah, Tom Telesco day 3 reach, as we always talk about, or day 2 reach on round 3 that we always talk about with guys like Pipkins and stuff like that, and JT Woods reach on the consensus board. I think they did fine for what it is. I was a little intrigued by them taking Bowers. JPJ obviously fell, I think, because of some of the medical concerns that teams had graded on him, but I think that, it really was just a matter of how the board fell to the Raiders. I think they got some contributors on day 3 as well. I don't think it was like the worst Telesco draft or anything, but I also don't think like you're going to get a lot of data from this draft that's going to either be predictive of what the Chargers are going to do in the future or what Telesco is going to do in the future. But I like the Chargers draft better than I did the Raiders draft. I don't think the Raiders draft was the worst thing in the world, though. I thought it was fine for the purposes of they're kind of an in-between year anyway at quarterback, and they didn't really get like Penix or anyone like that to fall to him. Not that I would have taken Penix with the first round pick anyway. I think that was a horrible decision by the Falcons. But I think, I think it kind of is what it was in terms of the Raiders draft. I thought it was probably top 15 draft in the NFL. I thought the Chargers landed in top 5, top 10 range. I know they're kind of graded as like 6 or 5 on like most of these, released draft grades after. The Cardinals stand out to me as a good draft. I love getting Marvin, Max Melton, and Trey Benson. That was a killer draft. Steelers are a killer draft. I kind of joked on stream. I was like, the Steelers got all the offensive line trench guys. The Cardinals got the wide receiver cornerback guys. Like, that is absolutely the dichotomy of like the Steven Steelers like mock draft and the Alex Cardinals mock draft, plus, Benson, like I mentioned. Eagles have a pretty impressive draft, obviously getting Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell, right? I'm reaching for names here. I'm at 1 hour and 9 minutes. But yeah, I think the Chargers, especially what they did on day 3, really elevated their draft compared to some of the other teams. So was really impressed by all that. So that'll do it for today. That is the last question. I've been going for 70 minutes. I did not expect to go for 70 minutes. But thank you guys kindly for watching. Thank you for watching this channel and everything throughout the pre-draft process. Bolt up as always. I hope you guys will stick through us through the offseason. I don't know exactly when my next video or my next post is going to be, but thanks to everybody who watched and tuned in with us all 3 days of the draft. Couldn't do it without you. The marathon is over, and I'm going to go sleep. So bolt up, or I'll power down the batteries for a little bit. But see you guys later.